Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Edwin Rutsch, Director of the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy, and here we're talking about empathy, and I'm here today with Fritz Breithaupt. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
I mean, it's a great honor to be on your, how should I even call it? On your
podcast, interview, I don't know.
Podcast, your show. Exactly. I like that. So thank you. Thank you. I am a researcher at Indiana University in Bloomington. My career is combining two fields, the humanities. So I'm trying to have a PhD in comparative literature, humanities, and cognitive science. I also hold an appointment here in the cognitive science department, and I run the experimental humanities lab at Indiana University, where we use empirical methods to examine and test issues that are of a special relevance for people who work in the humanities who have large questions. Maybe that's what you mean.
Yeah, and you wrote this book, The Dark Side of Empathy, which we're talking about. This is our second discussion. And in the first one, we talked about your book, and we spent quite a while talking about the definition of empathy. We talked about chapter 1, the loss of self. You have a whole series of criticisms, 5 major criticisms of empathy. We covered the first 2, which was loss of self, and you're saying empathy fuels division by people taking sides. Mm-hmm. And I'm arguing that, well, in a sense, you're arguing that empathy has light and dark aspects to it. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that empathy is inherently light, and that the things that you're calling the dark sides are actually blocks to empathy, and that we need to overcome, find ways of overcoming those blocks. So, so I guess we just wanted to jump into, unless you want to say anything else, we can start with the chapter 3, which was false empathy, filtered empathy, I think it was.
That's the title, yes, very good. Yes. Okay, well, if I take up the baton here briefly, and I agree to your summary, I think it's a very fair summary. What I usually like to add to it right away is to say that my position is not one to be against empathy. I mean, I wrote a book that's called The Dark Sides of Empathy, but that does not mean that I want to dismiss it. I do very strongly believe that empathy is one of the things that makes us human in all respects, and that empathy is something that we do need to cultivate, that it does a lot of very good things. So I'm not questioning that part. What I do question, and this is where our discussion really got very lively in our last meeting, was to say that I don't think empathy is the solution to all problems, or not empathy by itself, that empathy suffers from certain weaknesses, unfairnesses, and so on, that lead to behavior that actually we need to control by things that are outside of empathy. So today, we'll talk about a couple of other aspects of that kind, and we'll see whether you would agree, that would still then hold your opinion that it's ultimately these are wrong forms of empathy. While I would say, well, no, these things probably come with empathy. That may be differently strong in different ones of these 3 different dark sides.
So we want to sort of delve into it and kind of look at the nuts and bolts of what you're talking about, and see, what is it we're talking about with the criticisms you have, and then, just kind of have a dialogue, an empathic dialogue, mutually listening, mutually hearing each other in a positive way to kind of tease out these different aspects. You do have a list of the benefits of empathy. Maybe we can cover those at the end too. I did make notes of those too. So, okay, false empathy, filtered empathy, that's chapter 3 of the book. And I think you're saying there that people become the helper, right? They empathize with someone, and then they sort of take on this helper role, and they think, I'm the hero, I'm going to help this person. And then it has sort of negative consequences, that sort of helper role. Is that?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in and kind of explain my model, and then we can take it apart. I mean, as you said, the nuts and bolts here. And what I would say here is the following. Usually, when people hear me talk about my ideas to say, well, empathy has this dark sides, that are very serious dark sides we have to consider, that always at this conversation, there's one moment that comes up where someone then says, well, okay, Fritz, I hear what you have to say. Okay, maybe they even admit the one or the other point, but then they will always at some point say, but empathy is all good because it's because of empathy that we help other people. So that's basically what I'm responding to, this idea, oh, empathy leads us to helping others. And I'm not denying that empathy can do this. In fact, even my argument is that we'll do this, but I want to question a little bit how that happens that we do this. So what I want to suggest there is that when people see someone else in need, humanitarian aid, or someone, having an issue on the streets, tripping, or something like that. There's a lot of situations where someone needs help. Then people, luckily, help. In many cases, they do the right thing. And I wonder what exactly is the motivation in some of these things, especially when we talk about larger commitments of helping people jumping into action, making a commitment, a large financial one, or offer a significant amount of time for that. And I think people have many good motivations for that. And it's also just good that they do it. I'm not questioning any of these kind of things. But I wonder about the role of empathy and empathy-like processes in this. And here, what I suggest is that in many cases, people will say, well, if you ask them, they say, yeah, I have empathy or pity or compassion. They may use different words for this. That's why I'm helping. And that often can be true. I don't have reason to undermine individual people's beliefs there. However, I think as a large trend, and this is ultimately then my criticism here, is that in many cases, people probably don't really empathize with the people in need. Rather, I think they kind of model themselves after the hero. They identify with the helper, basically, the positive figure who intervenes to help, which is a good thing. They're helping. But it's a different thing at the same time. It does not necessarily involve empathy. So by identifying with the hero figure, you put yourself in a good role. You see yourself as someone who helps, doing laudable behavior. You can clap yourself on the shoulder, or you imagine that others kind of lionize you and praise you for your good behavior. And also then of the person, the victim or the person in need, may also be very thankful to all the good things you have done. So far, so good. Okay, maybe it's not empathy, maybe it's just hero identification. But that dynamic can flip. And that's what I'm interested in here too, in a certain sort of, it's not just that it's not really empathy, it's something else here. It's also something that is begging for recognition. The one who identifies as the hero helper, as I call it, feels like I deserve praise for this. And if this praise doesn't come, it's a problem. Then there can be resentment. There can be negative feelings about the person who is in need, whom they're helping. Hey, they're not recognizing me. They're not helping. They're not rewarding me for my helping. So there's limits in this kind of this model that seems to be based on compassion, and it is helping behavior, humanitarian aid, but ultimately it's that's why I call it false empathy. It may not have to do so much with empathy. True empathy, and in this case, I think this is actually one of the chapters where the two of us can come to a full agreement. With true empathy has to do with a commitment here. There you would relate to the individual of the other person. You understand their situation. You form a bond with them, that you be part of their life. But I think in a lot of cases, that's actually not really what's truly then happening. So rather, it's kind of this self-casting as the hero here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what you're saying that if, in a sense, that if you're in pain, I see you're in pain or you're struggling with something, and then I empathize, I sense your pain, your struggle, and then I want to take on the role of, oh, I'm going to help you, I'm going to rescue you. You're a victim. I sort of can turn you into a victim, and then I see myself as a hero, and I kind of want some kind of pats on the back for having helped you. And that you're seeing that has sort of a negative sort of a experience is what I'm.
It can have negative repercussions. So it doesn't always have that. In many cases, it's all fine. I mean, this leads to people helping others, which is a good thing. I mean, in most cases. I mean, of course, there can be bad helper syndrome things too, but that's not so much what I'm worried about. But there are some historical cases that I discuss. I should maybe mention one of them. This is very dear to me as a German. Is one of the cases was that Germany opened a border in 2015, in the fall of 2015, to refugees, political refugees, especially from 2 or 3 countries, Syria being kind of the most pressing one at that point, where there was a civil war. 3 countries in Europe, Sweden, Austria, and Germany, decided very rapidly. The leaders of the countries decided on the spot to say basically, oh, that's enough of that. We have to take every refugee from these countries because they're fleeing humanitarian disasters. We open them. We open the border. Other countries didn't follow through, and Sweden and Austria fairly soon afterwards blocked their borders again. But the German borders are still open today. Any refugee who has a political reason or as a refugee from war is welcome there and will be treated and integrated into the society. I mean, it's an amazing kind of thing. We have close to 1 million people came in the first 7 months of that when the border opened up. People in big need. That was a great thing, and I'm all for this. I think that was a very brave political act to do that. And of course, Germany as a rich country is in the position to and was able to do that. What I observed was something very strange in the population. In the beginning, there was a huge enthusiasm for this. People flocked at the train. They came in by trains because Germany doesn't have a border to neither Africa nor to Syria directly. They came in by trains mostly, and people were flocking the train stations as with welcome kind of things. They had gifts for the hundreds of thousands of people coming in there in the beginning, and they were very enthusiastic. That lasted for 2 months. And a lot of goodwill was there. And suddenly the whole thing completely flipped into a much more negative attitude, or the negative side got more attention. I mean, both sides still exist, of course, but the negative side got more attention. And I think that was, for me, the short-livedness of this hero identification. True empathy lasts. If there's a bond, it is something that you build up and so on. There's a commitment there. And when this was something different here, people like to see themselves as the positive welcomers, as the ones who could identify with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel at that point, who said, yes, we can do this. We can open the border. We can be the good people. But then this resentment developed that led to had a lot of negative repercussions. I mean, the border is still open and the society is divided about it. So it's not that they are not now all against the refugees or so, not at all. But it became something, this enthusiasm was not something sustainable.
Yeah.
So that's
okay,
one of
well,
it.
let me...
So now, please, yes, take over.
That basic, and there's sort of an agreement, I think, that I'm seeing, is that when we empathize with someone, so you're struggling and I listen to you and I hear where you are, I feel into your experience. So that's sort of one component. And in terms of the empathic listening, process, a lot of times itself that you're doing it not to be a helper, right? There's the helper role kind of happens out of different motivations. Like one is you feel sorry for the person. And at that point where you start feeling sorry for the person, you stop kind of seeing them. You become, it's your own sorrow, your own pain. You're no longer kind of present with the other person. I don't know if, and then that sort of blocks that sort of being present with the other person. And what you're saying with the helper. So I see that as sort of not empathy anymore, that it becomes, but there is something which is, this is also, there's this aspect of an individualistic empathy. It's seen as me helping the other person. And there's something about a mutual empathy. See, I'm interested in a culture of empathy So not only do I listen and hear the person who is struggling, if it was you, but then you would hear me. And then there's a sort of a co-design of solutions, right? You hear me, I say, oh, what about we do this as a solution? And then you hear me, and we sort of negotiate, mutually empathically negotiate a solution. Because a lot of this, I think what you're maybe addressing is like, the developed world, they say, oh, we're going to help the poor, developing countries. They do some kind of a program. They don't even really listen or empathize with the real needs. They have their own concept of what needs to be done to help. They create this big program and then it collapses, it just doesn't work because there was no real mutual empathic, co-design of solutions. So I see it more that sympathy or that, identification as the hero actually is something that is blocking a mutually empathic connection with each. And then that co-design, right? That we, so taking your example of the refugees, so, my parents were refugees from Germany. They were from, East Prussia, and after, and what happened, they were all kicked out and went to the West, and eventually were able to come to the United States. And so I have dual nationality, German, American nationality, because of that. So I appreciate, immigration. That's great. But in the sense of that, what happened with Germany is what the original problem is an empathy deficit in Syria, right? There's a breakdown of empathy all across. So the solution for me is to say we want to support a culture of empathy and transform Syria to be more empathic. If the refugees come, we should have an empathic dialogue with them, so that they're sort of like integrated. So they could have done like empathy circles, Germans and refugees. They could have like talked like, hey, I'm German, I'm really concerned. So the Germans would be able to express their concerns. Like, yeah, we want to help you out, but we're really concerned that this is just overwhelming us. So that the goal becomes to expand empathy. Like there could have been empathy training with all the refugees, right? They would all have an empathy circle training, for example, learn empathy skills. And so I think it's that expanding of the empathic skills and moving it throughout the whole system is the solution. And I sort of agree with you that, going into sympathy, feeling sorry, or identifying as the hero, and wanting pats on the back, that those are problems, but they're more like blocks to the sun, right? The empathy is that mutual. In fact, I would say it's two suns. Like if we can, maybe somebody's right. It's like you're a sun, I'm a sun. We're shining empathy connection between each other, and stuff can get in the way. And then it's what's getting in the way is that sympathy or that helper mentality becomes blocks to the sun. So that's I guess kind of would be my response.
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly on these sides, I would can imagine that. I mean, now let me start on the specific example here with the refugees coming in from North Africa, from Syria. They were also coming in from some other countries too. I mean, they were taking people from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from certain areas that were still kind of in a state of civil war, more or less. There are a lot of the refugees that arrived did not speak a language that most people in Germany would speak. They wouldn't speak German or English. I mean, those are two languages that they could have spoken. So there was already communication issues. Again, language is a key tool, but not the only one, and so on and so on. But then, of course, many of the people who came had lost family members or didn't know where the rest of the family were. Many of them were young males because they were more likely to be able to flee, leaving families behind. So they were in very strange and difficult situations. So it was very hard to connect them with people. They were also, they were traumatized, or they were also just sometimes just ill, sick, and all these kind of things. So there were a lot of immediate concerns there. But I agree. I mean, if they And the German government, of course, they didn't have a plan there. They did something that was the right thing to do, open the border, and then try to come up with the solutions afterwards. I would have liked the idea that you, with your dual citizenship that I didn't know about here, would have been one of the people that say, yes, Rutsch, exactly. It would have been exactly, it means the German meaning of that is a slide. So exactly. Right. That there would have been this welcome and a slide into some kind of communication culture of empathy, getting people together. And I think that was somehow not what was kind of the immediate kind of concerns. They thought, they immediately thought, we need tons of doctors. We need to house these people. We need to feed them. So they were wrapped up in a lot of practicalities. They had to figure out, okay, so suddenly we have hundreds of thousands of people coming in here in a very rapid time. Where do we bring them? They can't sleep. Even the train stations were overcrowding, so they needed to grab houses. So a lot of they were very, very busy. Now there's, just kind of considering that, there's like 2% of the population in Germany right now, I think that's about right, are refugees. That's a lot of people. If you would kind of see that in this country, it would be 8 million people would be refugees suddenly coming in without speaking English, mostly from anywhere else. So that's huge. So there was a lot of logistical issues. However, this could have been something organized more on the small levels. And some people did this. So there were volunteers who kind of said, hey, let's start a group where we talk, learn German or English too, and get things going and so on. So there were wonderful initiatives, there still are wonderful initiatives, but you should have been there. It would have been fantastic.
Yeah, well, maybe somebody will watch this program, this discussion, and they'll give me a call.
Yes, exactly.
Because I do see that's what is needed. Is even in the refugee camps. There's millions of refugees in Syria. If we start with the premise that there's an empathy deficit in Syria, right? That there's the sides aren't talking to each other. They're not, and a war is ultimately a ultimate, empathy deficit. That what we need to do is start training empathy skills. And, the American government's not doing it. The German government's not doing it. But it's like even in the refugee camps, it's not so much just helping, it's also training people in these empathic listening. We do this empathy circle process, which is sort of a basic, mutual listening. And it's the core of healing, the sort of the healing professions like therapy and counseling. And it's also the core of mediation. I do all kinds of mediation with the political left and right. And you get people together and have them in a structured, safe, more or less container with facilitators. You get them just talking to each other, and people start seeing their common humanity. And it's the empathy that does that. So I think that for like foreign aid, whatever, that these skill building, in the refugee camps is be training, teaching people empathy skills, bring the Germans, refugees together, have the refugees have empathy, circles between each other, and really transform society and place empathy at the core. And, just going into feeling sorry for people is not, I agree, is not, it's not the solution, or identifying as the helper. So basically what I see those as sort of blocks to this empathy. So I'm saying we need to expand the light of empathy. So every person becomes a light of empathy, metaphorically.
Yeah. I for me, what is interesting here is, and this is where we fully agree on, is that indeed this idea that you identify with the helper, or you become the helper, can be a block here for other forms of empathy. And interestingly, partly because people think that they're empathizing. Many people, I think just assume that by showing pity and compassion, thereby that's exactly the nature of empathy. That it involves a lot of listening skills and mutuality, of kind of being on the same level. That is something that then is
missing.
Yeah, and it's interesting in that respect. Our cultural heritage here has, of course, developed very precise terms for something like pity and compassion, but it often is blended with this idea of helping. So in that sense, we are culturally kind of mixing what we nowadays would call empathy with this kind of helping behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Not something that is on a horizontal level of looking at eye level
Mm-hmm.
each other,
Yeah.
listening and talking. And the metaphors that you use as that there are two lights shining at each other,
Yeah.
but rather that we see it as more as this pity the poor, pity the ones who need help, the humanitarian.
It's my light shining on you, you poor
Yes.
person. You know, it's not
Yes,
a mutual,
exactly,
it's not a
exactly.
relationship, right? It's like, yeah, it's sort of this superiority part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. There's
So,
less of that in our cultural heritage.
yeah.
That gives us that image that you are seeking here.
Well, that's what we're trying. That's what I'm trying to shift. That's what I think is the sort of the power of empathy is that there's another. This it comes back to it sort of overlaps with the dynamic you were saying before in terms of you know, two people in conflict that you identify with one side and you go to kind of rescue them, right? That was like your second criticism. This is sort of similar. It's seeing someone as a victim and that you have to go rescue them. And as soon as you see people as a victim, that also is a block to empathy. It's like seeing their humanity is not seeing them as a victim. So it's sort of this rescuer victim mentality becomes, I see it as becomes a block to this deeper quality that I'm calling empathy. And it kind of it also sort of overlaps in a way with your second criticism too.
Yeah, I can see that. And I mean, of course, that's where we have somewhat, I, as an academic, would call a conceptual difference in our ideas about empathy. Because for me, I'm interested in actually what does trigger empathy. And so this side-taking dynamic for me is actually, you call it a block to empathy, and it is a block, I mean, on some level. But it's also very, from my perspective, a very legitimate and powerful tool how empathy even gets started, namely that we choose one side over the other. But then, of course, it has negative consequences. We get polarized. Empathy leads us to increased polarization under specific conditions. And so for me, that actually is part of the whole empathy architecture, that we need triggers for it. It is not something that we automatically use. We're more careful about it. I'm seeing that. That's where I would say what you're trying to do is to kind of create a general culture of empathy. Empathy becomes, I would say, the default. Where we
primary social value.
Yeah, a social value and kind of the primary social relationship to everyone without discrimination. And from my standpoint, I would say, I think that's interesting. I mean, I find it also, I can see a lot of positive benefits in it. I'm not saying I reject it. I see more like what's actually happening in people is something different. So basically, you're describing where you would like people to move to. And I'm trying to describe what I see is happening.
Yeah, you see this, you're saying this is and I see that. I see that you're describing, you're seeing things, and I see how you're trying to do it. You're describing what you see is actually happening in society. And you're seeing, so what I would say is, you know, I think we talked about this last time, is that these processes, the things you're talking about, start with empathy, because you have to even perceive someone else's state, right? So there is a starting point of empathy, but I'm saying that there comes a point where the empathy is cut off, and that it's not the fault of empathy, it's the fault that people don't know how to maintain the empathy. And there's a switch that happens that people, because it's very subtle sort of dynamics. And I had given the example of my family in terms of this conflict, right? That, you know, two family members are in conflict. Instead of me taking one side, I just listened to them empathically. And then I listened to the other one empathically as well. I didn't say, you're right, you're wrong. Yes. I just said, this is what I'm hearing you say. Is that right? And then I talked to the other one. Is this what you're saying? Is that right? And then I just went back and forth for, you know, 15, 20 minutes. And when people feel heard, their tension level goes down. Their frustration level goes down when somebody understands them. I'm not even agreeing with them. It doesn't mean you're agreeing with them. I'm not taking your side. You know, I'm just hearing, clearly articulating what I'm hearing you say to your satisfaction. And then the other part of a culture of empathy is listening to everyone. And then the second part is supporting them in hearing each other.
Mm-hmm.
So then I said to those two family members, now would you listen to the other person, reflect back what you're hearing them say to their satisfaction until they get heard, and then it'll be your turn to say whatever you want, and they will reflect back what they understand you say. And it kind of goes, you know, I supported them. And then it turned into a whole family empathy circle where the other members came in and we kind of had this dialogue, and we slowly peeled away the onion of issues. We got to a core issue where somebody didn't feel like they belonged in the family. And once that was revealed, once that truth experience was revealed, then the healing started. And, you know, family members said, you know, I accept you, you know, so the issue started way off somewhere else, and it came to a whole different issue because they had this dialogue. So it's the same thing. What you're criticizing is that I say, oh, I'm going to rescue you because this person, you know, the family member, I'm taking your side. But that is no longer empathy. That is, you know, kind of taking somebody's side, identifying with them. And because I viscerally know the experience, I do this mediation, you know, I do it with the political left and right. So it's, you're describing a situation, but you also need to describe the reality of my experience of how the empathy really works. It's not like an idealized thing out there. It's something that I'm doing, you know, pretty often with mediation and so forth.
Yes.
So, but one more thing, each of these criticisms that you're having of empathy, it does start with empathy. So we have to start with empathy even to perceive these states. But then a switch happens where people jump out of empathy, and then it's those things that you're criticizing, it seems to me. But it's no longer empathy that you're criticizing, but the things that have switched to block empathy.
Let me describe in slightly different terms what you just told me about your family story here. And I mean, and I find it very powerful. I'm in full agreement that we need more ways to bridge differences, to not kind of hide conflicts, but try to mediate them and bring people together on many levels, on the factual solutions and emotional level. Now, what you were describing, I could also describe, say, in different terms here. So psychologists in the 1950s coined a notion, or 1960s, they talked about active listening.
Right.
And what you describe is a little bit that way. They were a little bit more cynical about it, or at least there's a cynical version of it. I want to give that to you, and I want to see how you apply to that. So some of these psychologists said, okay, active listening is exactly that. You listen to someone else. You don't say they're right. You repeat what they say, reflect it back in different words to make sure that they feel that you understand them, that there's communication, that they feel like, yeah, that's approximately, or as this is what I meant. And what happens now an interesting dynamic unfolds. When this active listening occurs, the people who have been spoken, they may have been very angry about some issue or very clear about it. Once they get the feeling that someone has heard them and reflects back to them, this is what you said, they hear agreement. Even if you don't say, I agree, they hear this agreement. So they get a certain validation of their opinion out of that. And once they got this validation, an interesting dynamic unfolds, which is they relax. They feel like, oh, I got what I needed. I got my validation. I have been heard. So suddenly, they are more relaxed. First of all, this has two effects. So one is they suddenly can listen better to other people. And they actually also much more likely to let certain points go. So they're more willing to accept what other people are. And suddenly they're able to compromise. They're suddenly giving into something. So that's, in a way, what you described here, only now that the mechanics behind it are a little bit different here. This way how this active listening was designed was much more like an instrumental reasoning, to say, oh yeah, you basically, by listening well to people, you validate them, you pat their ego a little bit, and then they are willing to let go of your ego. So it was an alternative to attacking a position. And it has to do with empathy, but it's a very instrumental empathy because this is a goal-oriented method for something like peacemaking. It is not necessarily the full sense of, I think, what you mean by the culture of empathy, where that becomes a kind of a, well, a habit, an expectation,
a way of being.
Yeah, a way of being.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what these people were doing these mediation studies there for this active listening. They were much more cynical. They wanted, I'm pushing it a little bit more than they meant it to, but they said, no, there's a way to say this is the most effective way to get people to agree to things, is that you first seem to agree to everything they say, and then they suddenly often give up on points.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
Okay. So it was, I could say that the active listening was really articulated and used by Carl Rogers. So he was a therapist in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yes, he's one of the ones, yeah.
And he was the one that sort of developed this and he found that when clients came, he found that, if I listen to them and I just accompany them on their journey, they're on this journey of self-exploration. And by being there and using sort of a reflection of the meaning, really showing, I understand where you are, what it is you're going through, and I'm accompanying you on that journey, that one of the things is that there's a feeling of connection. Like a lot of times when people have pain, suffering, or whatever, they're problem solving, they feel alone, they feel alienated. And that by someone listening to them, by hearing them, they don't feel so alone and alienated. They don't feel judged either. Like people are afraid to say their truth because I'm going to be judged. I'm going to be put down. They're kind of constricted. It's like, somebody's listening to me. They hear me. And so that was the client, therapist, and the healing. And it's kind of like the core of the whole therapeutic, active listening, empathic listening is now the core of the healing profession. And for me, what's missing there is there's two parts to empathy. It's a relationship. That is sort of a one-way, give me your money and I will give you empathy sort of thing, right? It's a,
yes.
And it's one way. It's the person is just being heard. So in a sense, it could even sort of feed narcissism. Like, everybody's going to listen to me, right? Yes. So I think that has a problem, is that it's not teaching how to speak empathically. Empathy is speaking. And the more open and transparent I can be in who I am and what's going on for me, the easier it is for you to empathize with me. If I'm hiding a lot of things, keeping things hidden, you can't empathize with me. So I've kind of taken that active listening or the empathic listening and make it a mutual. We mutually will listen to each other. And it is a crutch. I see it's a crutch. It's the first step, and it has immense benefits, so people can do it cynically. There's the FBI uses empathic listening to,
Good,
try
bad
to
cop, bad cop, exactly.
Bad cop, that kind of thing. So people can use it in that way, but I'm saying let's make a culture based on the underlying quality of hearing each other deeply and being present with each other, and that it's a mutuality. I call it it's not an individual, like a lot of these criticisms, they're sort of framed in this individualistic view of, we just take the perspective of one person, and they don't take the relational, that we are in a relationship, and what's the level of empathy in the relationship, right? And I think and that is a way that we look at the world, and it's not, and there's criticisms about that individualistic view, saying that therapy grew out of from men being therapists, and it was like this, you as an individual, autonomous being, you're empathic or not. And then some of the criticism are, we really, and I agree with, we need to look at the relationship. How empathic is the relationship, and how do we deepen that empathic relationship? So I guess I'm sort of building, and it's the same thing that happens in mediation. In the mediation, if you can get all the parties to start talking to each other, they start understanding each other, and they start getting to the core issues. And there's a whole process. I don't know if you've heard of human-centered design or design thinking.
Of course.
But that process, it says that any problem that you need to address, you need to empathize with people with what their felt experience is. and that then you identify the problems and you go into creativity, brainstorming mode, you know, and you hone in on a lot of ideas. You hone in on one that you think is really going to work. You create a prototype, you test it, and then you empathize, get feedback. So I see the empathy that I'm talking about is sort of like a gateway into the whole human-centered design framework. And the human-centered design can also be, oh, we're designers, we're designing for you. But there is a movement within design, which is co-design, that we will design together these solutions. And so you bring in the people you're designing for as partners in terms of the co-design. So I sort of see that as a whole sophisticated process for moving forward with the empathy. And there's all kinds of blocks, like you're saying, like, oh, I'm the hero, or you're saying I'm using it for manipulative purposes or whatever. So
or you get carried away to take a side, and that's a very powerful dynamic, very hard to overcome completely.
I do it.
Yeah, I know. No, I mean, empathy is, empathy is in a way kind of our better nature, but it's also one that kind of leads us down in many ways. Maybe we should move on to one.
Okay, let's go to the next one. The sadism is the one. Ready for that one? Okay.
Yes. And maybe I'll frame it very briefly here to give the basic idea, and then you can explain it in your different way here too. And that's actually, it connects well with what we were just talking about. So one of the other dark sides of empathy, one of the dangers of empathy, I think, is that is something that I call empathy for empathy's sake. Empathy, usually, of course, I believe that too, is a good thing that connects us with people. So it is not surprising that some people want to feel empathy. They want to connect with people and so on, and want to be also invigorated by the sense of the other person. That is all fine. However, I think this can be, when it becomes a dynamic that becomes its own purpose, it can actually backfire. So there can be this dynamic that people want and appreciate the pain of others, because the pain of others is a very strong trigger for empathy of the people who hear about it, or who learn or witness about it. So when, of course, when people, usually we hear that when people open up about what is ailing them, their past, their whatever it is, that can establish a strong bond. So it is not a far step from that, unfortunately, I believe, for some people to want the pain of the other, in a radical extreme case, even to cause the pain of the other, because that makes them relate to them. So the figure that I describe in the fourth chapter, and that's why I call it sadistic empathy, is exactly that person, or that figure that accepts or brings about the pain of other because it allows them to feel empathy. And this includes radical cases of sadism, of people actually causing harm, but it's also, there's a much more kind of a mild form that is socially more acceptable, what I call the everyday sadist, the one who kind of causes some kind of not well-being in someone, so because they know how that feels like. It can be, something like the teacher who's kind of doubling down on a student who is a little bit slow and doesn't understand what's going on or so, and pushes them a little bit too far, where they know that the student is not going to get it and is just suffering from it, but they can feel that, and they, in a certain sense, there is a bizarre, maybe perverted form of empathy involved here that lets them feel that, but they enjoy it nevertheless because they understand the pain of the other. So that's kind of one of the aberrations of empathy, but it's one that I think is not so uncommon. I think there's a lot of many forms of this everyday sadism, of people expose others, tease them, bully them. Again, bullies also, they have typically an empathy deficiency, but they're not completely empathy blind either in many cases. So they know what's going on there. They want the other person to suffer because it makes them feel good, because they understand it. There's a kind of a minimum of relationship in it. And that's kind of one of the other dark sides of empathy here.
Yeah, I see that, what you're saying. yeah, for me, that is sort of there's sort of a empathy for me as a power with, that we're sort of in relationship and we're hearing each other. And what you're sort of describing is sort of a power over. I have power over you. I can control you. I can put you down, and I can make you feel smaller, and I can sense your pain, and your pain makes me feel like more important than you, or I have some sense of control.
Yes, there can be that sense of control.
And I have this sense of control, and then that gives me a sense of, meaning for myself. And I would say that the empathy is not, it's not an on-off switch, right? We have empathy and non-empathic things that are going on in us all the time, right? There's all and so you can have some empathy feeling into the experience of others, and you can also have things that are, that you're doing to have power over others as well. So it can kind of like merge. But I would separate the two phenomenon, that there's one, so for me, if you're with it, that's teacher and the student. The empathic thing is to the student is empathizing with the students. Like, oh, I hear you're having struggles and tell me more about that. Let me hear. And the student says, well, I'm just feeling really stressed. My parents are just getting a divorce, and I'm feeling really terrible. So you say, oh, I really hear your parents are getting divorced, and you're feeling stressed, and you just keep listening to the student, and you hear the full background, which is kind of like what therapists do, right? They just hear out the person, and it's very healing. So the student would no longer feel alone, right? They would feel understood, and they would feel alone. And then it's having a mutual. It's like, oh, well, let me tell you as a teacher what I'm thinking. I'm really concerned about your well-being. I really want you to do well and succeed, and I really want to find solutions to help you out. And the student empathizes with the teacher. Oh, so you really want to help me out, so. And even if if the teacher was really being empathic about their truth, telling their truth instead of hiding it, they're trying to put the scenario you're saying, they're hiding their truth is, I want to put you down. If the teacher was honest, they'd say, hey, I really want to put you down. I really would like to see you suffering. That would be empathic comment from them. And then the student would empathize and say, I hear, teacher, that you want to put me down. You really want to make me suffer. Tell me more about that. And the teacher says, like, yeah, I have a horrible life with my partner. We're always fighting every morning. And I'm always being put down by my partner. And I need some sense of being able to put somebody else down so I feel better, or whatever. So and then the student says, well, I hear you're really wanting to do this. And then they have a dialogue, and then the student can say, it doesn't really feel good to me to be put down like this. And they have a dialogue, and then through that dialogue, through that mutual empathic dialogue, they would actually, I think they would come and connect with each other's common humanity at some point, and there'd be a mutual resonance with each other. So that would be like how the relationship would go in an empathic way. What you're saying, that there's this empathic quality, but on another part, they're trying to, control, this person. So they're maybe using their insight that they've gained from the empathy, but then they block the empathy and they kind of do this power over. So I think we have to kind of differentiate those different phenomenon and not blame empathy for that, because empathy, we're just, if you really expanded the empathy, I think it would lead inherently to a positive conclusion, because people because you would connect with the person eventually. If you do it long enough, you connect with your common humanity, and then when you have that common humanity, you take action sort of based on that.
Well, here, let me give you one of the examples here, because this common humanity, I think what our humanity is about is not always just a good thing. So one of the examples here is relationships of punishment. And humans have a deep sense that's part of both biology and culture, most likely, of punishing in certain occasions. So one of my colleagues in the law school, Jodi Madeira, published a book about interviews that she did with the people who witnessed the execution of Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh was the convicted bomber in Oklahoma,
right.
and he was in jail and was finally executed in Terre Haute. But she talked. Now what they did is, for the execution, they made this available for family members of the victims who died. I don't remember the precise number. 180 some people maybe died in the bombing attack. Maybe it was a slightly different number. But the family members were allowed to watch this live or via a very specific shielded off video site back in Oklahoma, and a lot of the relatives chose to do that. And what did they say? So one of the most common things they said is that they really wanted to see Timothy McVeigh suffer. So it was exactly as you were describing. It was a power relationship, and it was not one. They were not interested in dialogue. None of them wanted to talk to Timothy McVeigh. They wanted to see his suffering. They wanted to feel how he was suffering to some degree. So it's a very specific use that has something to do with empathy, but at the same time, there was absolutely no interest in dialogue in this case. So one could, of course, say this was not the empathy that you and I would hope for, obviously. It's not a dialogical one, but it is nevertheless a form of something that has to do with empathy. It is a form of empathy. They wanted to feel the suffering of the perpetrator here, of the mass murderer who had killed someone that they loved. They wanted to feel that, to feel more at peace with what happened here. And neither did my colleague. I don't want to criticize that or kind of say. I want to more use it to say that is part of the setup or cultural expectation also that is also connected to empathy, that even in terms of punishment, justified punishment apparently, in the minds of most people, we want to connect that with something like empathy, but a distant form of empathy.
Yeah, so in a sense, there's
it's an
empathy.
institutional. Yeah. So that last sentence, the institutional setting here is not one that is resolved in a conversation or so. Then you kind of resolve this or so. It's a very different framework of this. But it is one.
So you're wanting to feel the person suffer, right? It's like you want to have the experience of feeling them suffer because you feel like you've suffered and you want to feel them suffer, so that it kind of balances the books or get some kind of retribution out of them. And so, well, I would say that our current justice system is not based on empathy. It's based on one competition that you hire lawyers and they have a battle. Like it's a gladiatorial sort of a process, a verbal gladiatorial, and the idea through this gladiatorial struggle, the truth will somehow emerge. It's based on external judgment. There will be people externally who will judge the situation, and that there will be retribution, that you will be punished for, whatever, thing that you did.
If found guilty, exactly.
You're going to be punished. And so that is an unempathic system that we have. There's a restorative justice movement, which is trying to move towards a culture of empathy. And what that says is you bring all the people who were affected and you have that empathic dialogue with each other. So you create an environment where, you have the circle. And, I do that too. People are in conflict, families are in conflict, or people have done something. You bring them together and they use a full, deep empathy to dialogue with each other to work through their understandings. Like I went to an event where there was an African-American, it was an event where there was some kind of a killing here in Oakland nearby, and they were talking about it. And then one woman said, my son was killed, he was murdered. And it's like, what is justice? What is justice in that situation? And it's like, maybe that person there'd be retribution on them, but the person who gets that retribution, often they don't feel really deeply satisfied. They feel unfulfilled and feel at a loss, even though they see that retribution happening. Whereas if we have a culture of empathy, it would create that mutual, it would take conflict and bring it into an empathic mutual dialogue. And I think that would resonate through society and would actually head off a lot of the conflict and crime and so forth that has happened. Because when somebody kills someone else, like Timothy McVeigh had a huge empathy deficit, right? He did not empathize at all with all those 100 some odd people and children that, he killed and the suffering that was created. It was like, and he was doing it as retribution for the government having, done the Branch Davidians. So it's leading from one thing, one retribution is leading to the next retribution. And it's like this whole, and if like with Branch Davidians, if they would have said to the government, said, let's have an empathy circle. We're here to talk. We're going to stay here. And we're just going to keep dialoguing. And if that was like a core value within society that, I think it would head off so much. I mean, that's what I'm trying to work towards, is really shifting, very deep fundamental value systems within the culture, and so, and shifting it to be more empathic. So I do get that you're saying, oh, that person wants to see Timothy McVeigh, die. Yeah. They want that feeling of that, but they're doing it not from, they are perceiving, they are empathizing and feeling his suffering and sort of taking that, but they are not in a full empathic, in a fully integrative empathic culture, which is
no.
And it's like it's having them in a dialogue with Timothy McVeigh, saying, Timothy, this is what the impact of your actions had on me. I am devastated. My family is devastated. And for him to have heard it and to empathize with them, and for me, he could have done the rest of his life just being part of empathy circles with people that he impacted. So yeah, and so that's, yeah, I don't know how.
Yeah, no. I think both of us would agree that there should be there's a lot of possibility for reform of the justice system, especially, and also, of course, what we're both really interested in is, of course, effective ways of prevention of crime, and prevention in the sense of making it less likely that crimes are committed, of course, in the first place, so the whole situation doesn't arise. I like some of the things that you say. The one thing that I would add to that, of course, is that you cannot, or one should not force upon the victims of crime, the family members, that they would have to be part of an empathy circle or some kind of dialogue situation or so. They should have the right to opt out, if that is an option. To say, if there's, I come from a country that does not have the death penalty, where people, the strongest you get is life prison sentences, and there's a lot of activities there that connect, similar to what you describe here, the families of the victims, or the victim, that's not always murder, of course, to the perpetrator who's in jail, them, to get them into kind of a dialogical sense. And there's a report of very powerful things that can happen on both sides in that sense. That's definitely there. But at the same time, when also there has to be clear that, at least in my opinion, that no one has to be part of this. There has to be the right to say, I know this could be a good thing, but I'm just not willing to do this. I'm not willing to forgive. So there's something that people have to, there's a certain respect that I would have for that position.
Yeah. I'm not sure about, I am sort of wondering about that, because I see that attitude, like, I don't have to speak with this other person in the political realm. I see it all the time, like, is like, I don't have to speak to this person. And I think there's something we could do in society to make that more of a cultural norm. That, what I mean? That we develop a sense of trust. If we are doing, like, I will have an empathy circle with anyone, because I know the effect of it. I have a
Yes.
belief
Mhm.
and a trust
Mhm.
in the benefits for society, for myself, for everyone of doing this empathy. So how
Mhm.
much coercion you use, to coerce, I'm not quite sure, because we do use coercion in the justice system. The justice system is all about coercion.
Of course. I mean,
Traffic lights are coercion. There's all kinds of laws.
mhm.
And, so I'm not quite, I haven't quite worked out that level. But I think if it becomes a cultural norm and people have developed trust in this process, because there's plenty of people who say, we don't want the, perpetrator of a murder of our son or whatever killed because we, value life or whatever.
Mhm.
So the level of, I know people are traumatized. For them to maybe face, someone that killed somebody in their family or raped them or something would be very difficult, even though in a trial, we do have that pretty much that coercion. When you have a trial, everyone does get heard in the trial. So there is quite a, degree of coercion in
There's
that.
coercion there, but yeah, but it's
I'm not
there's
sure.
of course a different level of coercion too, of course. So, and then, of course, sometimes there are people too. I mean, and we've not talked much about that, about psychopaths and sociopaths, where there's the question whether really how far this dialogue will go ultimately. So that actually can also be something where I would say, for the family of the victims, let's say in the case of a murder or so, they may face a perpetrator that actually would leave them, I mean, deeply troubled, where ultimately this is not leading somewhere. Or maybe a more sociopathic perpetrator who kind of starts to manipulate them, and ultimately they understand they're just getting manipulated by this, and this is worse than it's not just a waste of time. They get even manipulated. So in that sense, I'm a little bit careful for advocating it for all situations. That I would say I think there is a legitimate way on that level that you don't have to have this two-way empathetic relationship then.
Okay,
But it can be a positive thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen many reports about it, extremely powerful and very positive.
So with the psychopath, we're talking about 2% of the population, right? Maybe
That's not few, but in maximum security prisons, it's half of them.
Yeah, because they end up right, exactly. So with the 2%, I did an empathy circle with a person named Sam Vaknin. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he wrote a book called Malignant Self-Love, and he's an avowed narcissist with psychopathic tendency. He's out of Europe, and he wrote a book about it. And he's sort of the go-to guy for if you want to talk to a narcissist. He's made a whole career out of it. And they did a documentary on him, and they traveled throughout Europe to the different research centers, and they actually tested him, for his narcissistic.
I actually have heard about him now that you say that. Yes,
I did 2 empathy circles with him, and it was like, it would blow your mind, because when we were in an empathic discussion, as long as we were in this mutually empathic discussion, he was actually very, he appreciated it. He shared real, things in his life. It's sort of, it contained that psychopathy or narcissism because it was a mutual relationship. And, yeah, so there is something about this empathy. The other part of it is if you know Christian Kiesers, he's in Holland. He studies mirror neurons and so forth. So he did a study with psychopaths, and I've seen other studies too, saying that psychopaths actually do have empathy, but they have it off by default.
Yes, I know. That's kind of the famous studies. Yes.
Yeah. So that's sort of what I was seeing with Sam, that if you can get people into these empathic dialogues, you have the basic structure and you just do it over and over again, you sort of like can turn on and sort of rewire. So if they're in the prisons, I would say that the prisoners should be doing empathic skill building, 4 or 5 hours a day ongoing, and instead of whatever else they're doing, because it's learning these skills and this sort of mindset. I think that the brain could be through practice, be rewired so that the empathy is sort of turned on by default, you know. So I guess that's how what would sort of address that. So it's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now I am not an expert on psychopaths. I've talked to some of the experts of psychopaths, like Ken Keel in this country and others, or Jean Dissety, the neuroscientist in Chicago. And they all, I mean, the one thing that they always say is, yes, it is interesting to know, I mean, these new findings, that psychopaths are not brain dead. They have the capacity for empathy, which is we didn't know until a couple of years ago, or 10 years ago by now. But as you said, they don't automatically use it, right? Our default is that we empathize. They may feel nothing. They can observe the worst things without feeling anything. But if you remind them to say, oh, could you please empathize? That they suddenly react to things in certain situations. But I think we're very far away to say, oh, we can automatically train them. We can bring them back. It may be just, be very short situations. It might not be a lived empathy. But again, I'm not an expert on this, so I want to be careful about it. And then, of course, the other side about it is that people on the spectrum of psychopathy, sociopathy, however one defines it, tend to be low on the emotional empathy side. I mean, that's kind of one of the definitions, but they can be very normal on the theory of mind or cognitive, sometimes called cognitive empathy side, meaning they understand other people. So they can be very manipulative, and that's kind of can be a dangerous combination, very harmful one too, but a lot of it becomes utilized for their own narcissistic reasons. That's what I thought, and what some studies seem to confirm as well.
I would say that the manipulation, though, is you stop empathizing when you are manipulating. So it's not the empathy that's the problem.
No. In that case,
it's the
manipulation
that is the problem, and that.
So
we need to be looking at what is the switch. Why do people switch from an empathic state into a non-empathic state? You know, and often it's fear with the psychopaths and the people in prison. A lot of it is, and I hear it over again, is they had an upbringing that was very unempathic. You know, people who maybe have a disposition to psychopathy, you know, the hormones, high testosterone or whatever. But if they grew up in a very supportive, empathic environment, that they sort of take that on. So that's why the culture of empathy, you know, spreading empathy throughout society, I think is an important, you know, goal or vision. But so we do want to we get to the fifth one, vampiristic empathy. Do you want to get?
Yes. So vampiristic empathy, I define as the kind of the desire to live through others. The possibility that empathy opens up is that we experience the life of others, that we can slip into their shoes and walk through them and be part of their ups and downs of their life and their glories and so on. And that's a wonderful ability that humans have. And we might be alone with it. It allows us to be connected, to have the deep relationships that you cherish and you describe. And that is absolutely wonderful. It does have here another flip side to it, that it can lead to people wanting to manipulate others to live the life that they want to observe and co-experience. In some cases, this is a harmless thing. What we're talking about, this can be a fan who watches kind of their sports star or the singer or the Hollywood actor and kind of and likes to bask and be part of the glory of that, of their successes, or also suffers from the failures. When you talk about sport, it's a lot about not accomplishing something, and you can go through that, and from a distance, the fan is allowed to participate in their life and feels more kind of invigorated by that and participates not in a clear relationship, but from a far away, they imagine it in an imaginative way. That's good. That's fine. I don't describe that as a problem. It opens you up to other possibilities. How life is differently, but it can flip over into a more demanding relationship that becomes manipulation. The fan can turn out into a stalker who wants something in return for their relationship. And the key example, and what I'm really talking about here is, or a key example in our culture here, is the helicopter parent. And there's different understandings of what that exactly entails, and how we should best understand the phenomenon of the helicopter parent. But one way to look at it, the one that I propose, is that the helicopter parent manipulates, usually the child, of course, in such a way that they want the child to live a life that they want to co-experience. And that means, of course, it's a life full of success, sheltered from certain things, sheltered from making the silly mistakes that the parents may or may not have done themselves, to go through this phase of childhood and teenagerhood unharmed, in such a way that they come out as these perfect people who have the perfect experiences, who make it into the fantastic college, or who are very good at sports, who have wonderful partners and have a glorious life. So the vampiristic motivation that I kind of see in some helicopter parents is to manipulate the child, thereby robbing them of their own life, manipulating in such a way so that the parents can co-experience this more wonderful or more successful life, which of course has devastating effects. I mean, we can talk about that too, but the statistics are pretty clear about that. Helicopter parenting is right now the majority of parenting at this country. It has also taken roots in other parts of the world. Europe is not as strong as the United States, but it's coming up. It's very strong in some parts of Asia as well. These overprotective parents who kind of really start to control every aspect of their kids, and also become these snowplow parents who kind of push away all the obstacles on the way for the kids. It means the kids are much less independent. They suffer from more anxiety. That is all something that we see. I'm a university professor, so we see that now in the university college population. Yes, there's a lot. Anxiety is now the kind of thing we deal with. 30 to 40% here at my university and at other universities nationwide suffer from severe anxiety. That is new. And this is now the first full generation of where the students are come from some form of helicopter parenting. Now the estimates are above 60% of parents in America, North America, are using this somewhat that can be described as helicoptering. It's not well defined, so we have to be careful about the terms here. And I'm using broad concepts to describe something that I see here. It does have one paradoxical side that one has to mention, is that the kids of helicopter parents tend to have better school grades. A lot of it has to do with school success, and the parents are successful in that regard. So the parents are in a certain trap here too, that there seems to be some demand on them. But for me here, what interests me is this relationship of vampiristic empathy, where people feel empathy with someone because they want to co-experience that life, but then start to kind of literally, like a vampire, suck out the blood from these people and rob them from their own ability to make their own decisions and be independent. So it's not a relationship, it's a very one-sided relationship. I watch out for you, I'll observe you carefully, but in return, I get your life, basically. I get to live your life in my fantasy. So there's an aberration of empathy. We both would agree on that very quickly. It's not something like empathy how we would wish it to see. But I fear it's a dynamic that I don't think it's always unfolds, but it's one that apparently people slide into it all too easily in some cases. It is an attractive option.
Well, for me, it's really about the empathy circle in the family, right? It's about, and I remember I did some empathy circles with students who were going to Stanford. They're high school students, but taking Stanford courses. And I did some empathy circles with them, and they were just sharing, what was going on for them. And the amount of stress that they were feeling and sort of issues was like, I was like, that wasn't my experience, in the 60s or 70s in school, it was kind of laid back and just pretty easy. So I did, see some of that. So for me, in terms of the solution is, again, like what is those family empathy circles and being able to share. like when the children, if they're feeling stress and anxiety, do they feel comfortable saying, you know, telling their deeper truth, right? Instead of their truth being suppressed, the parents say, no, no, they discount, you know, any stress, you know, push yourself. They may not be hearing what the student is feeling. It's like, oh, I'm feeling really stressed about this. I'm really, you know, this is really bothering me. And so there's not that deeper empathy, and it's also not mutual. So I do like family mediation, and it's like bringing families together so that they talk to each other. And it's amazing how families where people are supposed to love and care for each other, how they haven't developed relational skills. I mean, it's so rampant. People just don't have these skills in their family. So I think that is what's missing. If for a culture of empathy in a family is that mutual listening, they're sitting down, fully hearing each other, that there's no sense of fear in the student. If they're feeling afraid that they can't share where they are, then there's an empathy deficit there, right? They're not able to be open, transparent about what their real feelings are, as well as the parents. You know, maybe the parents are needing to share something like, hey, my life, I feel it was a total waste. I feel like I haven't accomplished things. And the child listening, oh, you're really, you know, reflecting that and hearing. And then I think out of that honesty, a real positive relationship develops, and it wouldn't be a manipulative helicopter. So that helicopter, that controlling, that pushing, you know, is itself a block to the open, empathic, deepening relationship. So, I mean, I see you're like, each of these things sort of our relationships start with empathy, but you're pointing out all these blocks, all these things that are going in there and blocking empathy. And that's my whole point, is each of these blocks needs to be confronted and transformed to allow empathy, the light of empathy, to shine. So it's kind of like there's this, it's like the moon, right? The moon goes in front of the sun, and you have an eclipse. It's not that that's not a dark side of the sun. That's just a block of the moon in the way of the sun. And if we just can clear away the block, the sun, the mutual sun, will kind of shine on each other. So metaphorically, so I'm appreciating all the blocks that you're articulating, but my whole point is you can't put that onto empathy as the cause. So if your book was like, oh, the blocks to empathy and what we can do about it, I'd be totally in your court, and I could help you write it, you know. Instead, it's not like the dark side of empathy. It's like, I guess that's sort of the difference. And I think that these are very subtle, these are subtle switches that, you know, people just need to become aware. So and that's where maybe sometime we can do an empathy circle with some others, and maybe with John Desity. You know, he had commented, I saw on LinkedIn on you, we could do an empathy circle together to actually use mutual empathic listening, and then give a critique of where you think that that's not working. Because with those parents, it's the same sort of process in that family, that the parents listen to each other, that they can be honest with each other, and that they can work out their differences, and they can see the deeper feelings and issues. And so I guess that's what I'm saying, that I don't see the stalker, like the stalker is not empathizing with the needs, the deeper needs of the person that they're stalking. Plus they're identifying. If you start identifying, that's a block to empathy, you know. So you know, and stage mothers who are pushing their kids, they're not hearing. I mean, the kid could be crying and they're pushing them on the stage. Exactly. You know, they're not saying, oh, tell me, you know, let me fully hear all the feelings, all the experiences you have, and then we'll negotiate, we'll talk together. Let me tell you what my needs are. And then we will negotiate that together to our mutual satisfaction, where we don't feel, you know, control in there.
I mean, on the case of the children, there's this is also, there's different cultural attitudes playing into it here. So here, I mean, I live in this country. My kids are born on this continent too, and they would probably, I don't know what they identify. I mean, fairly, one of them at least very cosmopolitan, but I mean, probably also partly at least they identify as American. But one of the big things that is extremely different from even just from Germany, which is not in all respects that different from America, is that in education, the parents didn't tend to have this feeling of responsibility in the sense of success of their kids in terms of academic success, in terms of grades or so. They're very good parents. They're very full of love, just like American parents. There's a lot of love there. I mean, there's a lot of goodwill there in different ways, and it manifests itself differently. But the European parents, at least the European parents that I grew up with and that I saw, were kind of saying, well, okay, so our job is to raise you, but in terms of the successes and failures and so on, yeah, you do that yourself. The parents don't go to the sport games of the kids. They don't watch it. There's no soccer parents or so. Then there's, in terms of the school grades, yeah, they want to know that the kids are doing their homework, but what grades they get, okay, we'll deal with that, whatever the grades is, that's how it will work out. And here a lot of the parents, and this is something that I observe, I am an American parent in this country here, is the parents I can feel very involved. It's their identity. They don't separate themselves from the kids very much here. And if you don't separate yourself much from the kids, in a way, it's almost, you can't really empathize with them because they're too close to you. You identify, you project yourself on them also, or you what you want the kids to do. And that's so in a certain sense, for me, I would, in the case of the family, I don't know what exactly your empathy circles all involve. But in the case of the family, I'm almost a little bit cautious to say maybe the desire of the parents might be this empathy circle because they feel so close to their kids, they want to really eat them up. They want to process them fully. So the empathy circle might fit their wishes. But maybe there's also a little bit more healthy distance needed for us, a little bit more autonomy on the kid's side before empathy can then evolve, where they really say, oh, the kids have their own formed identity. They have desires and wishes that may not conform to who the parents want them to be or so. And then on that basis, you can have that dialogue, but you also need to give them some buffer room. So it'd be a little bit, so it's maybe an ordering kind of side. I'm not saying that empathy is much needed in families. We both agree on that. But it might not be kind of something like there's a danger of enforced empathy that just kind of binds the kids too closely to the parents. Periods where they have to break off too.
Yeah, one thing would be to try an empathy circle in your family. Force that. One thing. Well, yeah, I agree. You don't want to just a little microcosm where you have like an empathy circle just with your one little group. I would say having it in school too. And so for me, I spent, after high school, I spent 10 years traveling, around the world, just working and traveling my way around. And I see that as an important part is to reach out to as many people and have an empathic relationship with them. So I do a lot of empathy circles with a lot of different people. And I find that sort of enriches my life, and it gets me out of that. I think what you're concerned about is sort of an in-group family, even an in-group, and you don't have a sense of outside relationship. So that is I think the more people that the kids can have, or even the parents can have these empathic relationships, they will bring back that richness and it will enrich the family too. So I'm totally there, and that's the basis of a cult, right? Cults is you're not supposed to have your parents, you're supposed to get rid of your parents, you're supposed to cut off relationships. And I see the exact opposite is we want to have relationships with as many and as wide a variety of people, because that informs the richness of who we are.
Yeah. And this is maybe something I've come back to one of your earlier points too about this. when we talked about the political divides. I mean, this is the day, and I've not looked at the news here so far, where there's an impeachment vote in the House happening, where political polarization is very manifest in this country here, as we all know. I mean, it's something the space we breathe. I always recommend to everyone, and I try to practice that myself, is that I seek out people who have extremely different opinions from me, who also live differently than me. Not in all respects. I mean, we can't always do that and so on, but at least in some issues. I know there's some people who are extremely different from me, and I make an effort to say, okay, I'm reaching across the aisle here. I will actually I understand that we are not usually part of the same social group or so, but let's see something that happens here. And I mean, like traveling through the world, I mean, oh my gosh, I mean, this is like one of the best things one can possibly do, seeing cultures that are very different from the ones that your own. I mean, it's so eye-opening what's happening there, because you need, in a way, difference is one of the best possibilities to develop closer attention to other people, to really trying to see what exactly do they mean when they say that. They say the same thing as I would say, but they mean something different. What is it that I'm hearing here? Yes, and empathy too on that, very important in that. I mean, this fine-tuned kind of thing. And it's easier to learn this with people who are very different from you, at least for most people. And you can make it an effort. I mean, it's really something I would urge everyone to say, yes, you can't do that in every moment of your life, but find some place, make it to know at least, yeah, I'll make an effort to talk to people who are very different from me, and I will be willing to kind of set aside certain of my pre-understandings to really listen.
And we do. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I mean,
we do that online. We have these online empathy circles where we bring the political left and right together, and we've had talks about like abortion. You know, people on both sides. You know, really hot topics that generally it'd be easy for it to blow up. But when you use the empathy circle, one person speaks, they get fully heard, then they take turns. It just creates a container, you know, for having those conversations be more constructive. So that's why I keep going back to this empathy circle process, as well as with the political that you're talking about. I really see it that the politicians, instead of an impeachment, they should have had an empathy circle. I would like to see Trump, you know, Pence, the vice president, Schumer, and Pelosi. They once were in the office and they had this discussion. I don't know if you remember that, you know, last year or something. They were talking kind of ad hoc, just kind of talking. If they would have had an empathy circle for 3 hours, just doing empathic listening, I think it would have changed the whole country. So that is really my goal, is to bring this simple practice into the political system. And I would like to take, you know, some empathy tents, set them down on the Capitol Mall, you know, in Washington, D.C., and say, we're not leaving until you have empathy circles with each other across the aisle. Because the majority of people just don't know really how to do empathy well. And I think you're pointing out all the problems, the things that are blocking. There's so many things that block empathy. But a true empathy, I think, is really the thing that can, you know, really transform society. And that's kind of what I'm, you know, kind of working on.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. You know that I'm the skeptic in me has a lot of things to say about this, obviously. And I know of the experiments of, yes, you have something like the empathy circle thing they tried out in Ireland. We talked about that in the last sequence. Students, Catholic and Protestants, tried this out. It seemed to work. But then in the end, it only deepened their own sense of belonging to one or the other group. So there's the hidden dangers in that. And
it wasn't an empathy circle, though. They did not. I guarantee you, they didn't do an empathy circle. And the culture, it needed to be a cultural. It needed to be the politicians, the people in power, modeling an empathy circle with each other across the political divide. Instead of yelling at each other in the parliament, they needed to be sitting down in small groups, having recorded empathy circles, as well as the schools bringing those empathy circles. And it's an ongoing thing. It's not like, oh, we're going to do a little test, and then it's over with. I mean, that's it
I
just fits.
yes.
The overall culture just absorbs it and transforms it. We need a total cultural shift to a culture of empathy, and it needs to, yeah. So
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we need a lot of more. This is something on the small scale everywhere. We need this. People talking to each other. The different members of the Senate and the Congress should model this, that they make sure that they have dinner or lunches and so on with small groups from people from the very opposite aisle all the time. Here's something interesting, that in German companies, this is not so known in this country, or some people know this. German companies, and they're successful in the world. We're not talking about minor kind of things. This goes all the way up to the biggest ones. Have in their management team, a real management team. We're not talking about some kind of, they always have representations from the workers in it. The union is part of the management team. So to say, hey, we are one company. We are in this united. It's not the management against the workers or something like that. They have a very different culture. You would call it culture of empathy here. I mean, they call it differently. They call it Mitbestimmung, meaning co-determination of the future of the company, so that everyone is on the round table. I mean, there is something about this.
It's in that direction. That's the direction, the general direction. Yeah, instead of it being confrontational, it's the management against the workers is, hey, we're in the same company. We need to empathize with each other. And it's the empathy will come up with the new creative ideas. Like conflict is fine. It's through the listening and dialoguing with each other that these new creative ideas will emerge. So it's totally, I'm totally for that. And I've seen that too in Germany, that I think it helps with the worker relationships and less strikes and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, they strike too. There's conflicts that emerge from it, but at the same time, they have different levels on which they can then kind of overcome this too. And so,
I know we've gone an hour and a half, and I can talk forever, but I want to keep you, because I love talking to you. It's great that you're willing to dialogue, you're willing to share, and I really appreciate that, about you, and really willing to take this time. So if you want to talk more, I'm glad to do another round. We haven't talked about the benefits yet, because you had a couple of benefits.
Oh, there's a long list, of course, too. No, I'm not. But maybe, I mean, we also have empathy here with other listeners and so on. Someone who goes through this tape is at this point here at 90 minutes of this. That is plenty. I think for the moment, maybe we'll say this is not the final discussion what we have, but we kind of,
Yeah, so maybe we'll have an empathy circle at some point we can get a couple others, and I can model how the empathic, I can reach out to Jean Destiny, since he commented on some of your work on LinkedIn.
He's one of the leading neuroscientists that you can reach in the world.
So great. Well, then, then thanks so much. We'll follow up, and if you have time, we'll do an empathy circle or anything. If you want
I have more thoughts too about exactly how we'll continue this. So thank you very much.
Cool. All right, thank you so much.